So what's a GMO? So what is a GMO? Well, we know, or we should know, we're watching this, GMO is a genetically modified organism. Well, hybridization is also genetic modification. Think about that. Hybridization is the same thing in a sense, except instead of transferring one specific gene, it's transferring all the genes. And then you know, it's a shotgun approach to it. You may or you may not get what you want when you hybridize something. I talked about, so we know that GMO is produced in a laboratory by scientists in a laboratory who take one gene, who take a gene out of one species, and through a chemical means, almost always a chemical means, in test tubes on the laboratory bench, create plants that have the trait. And that's one of those things that I learned to do, not by the method that they're doing it now. I never learned to do it the way they're doing it, but I did learn to do it when I took a biotechnology class when I was in college. And I never used it, but I learned how to do it. So it was interesting, but the way we did it was totally different. It was not as specific as the pinpointing of traits. It was more like cross-pollination. The way I learned to do it was taking what is called a protoplast. And that's where they have taken one plant, one cell, or one plant, and they have used an enzyme to break apart the tissue in the plants and to release just the individual cells within the plant and remove the cell walls. And then you could take that with any other cell that did not have a cell wall and apply an electrical charge to it, and it would cause the cell membranes to merge. And then the cell membranes would merge, and I guess eventually the DNA or the nuclear membranes would merge, and the DNA would stand a chance of coming together. That's called electroporation. Now, I learned to do that when I took a biotechnology class. But the methods that are used now, I mentioned when we're talking about agrobacterium and the discovering of the bacteria that transferred the GMO or the Roundup resistant trait was found in a bacterium, and they took that gene out of that bacterium and put it into plants. They were very, very specific and were able to identify that one particular gene, and then they were able to identify exactly where in the chromosome they wanted to put that gene. So they didn't just do it willy-nilly. They didn't just use a shotgun approach and blast it into the cells and take a chance of it landing right in the middle of another gene that was really important to the cells, to the plant surviving. And that's the way they used to do it at the beginning. And I believe some of it may still be done that way. But for the most part, most of the transfer of genes is done by bacterium. And I can't tell you how it's done because I haven't learned how to do it. But they're using bacterium called agrobacterium, and it's done in the laboratory. And I said, just like I just said, I repeat it, transferring an individual gene into a specific spot. In fact, when I talked about the sugar beets, when the scientists did transfer the trait, the herbicide-resistant trait, into sugar beets, they put it in the female genome, which means they put it on the X chromosome. That doesn't keep it from being transferred by pollen, because male plants produce both X chromosomes and Y chromosomes. They don't produce them, they have them. So when the plant produces pollen, a pollen grain can contain the female chromosome, the X chromosome, or it can contain the male chromosome. So there would be a 50% chance of the pollen from a sugar beet producing a GMO hybrid. And that's not a chance that a lot of producers want to take. But at least in the sugar beet, there would only be a 50% chance that it would happen. But that's what's going on. We know the scientists have mapped the genome. They know the order of every gene. They know the order of every DNA particle in the DNA. They know all of the different bases, all of the different molecules within. No, DNA is a molecule. They know all of the different bases, all of the different atoms, and the order of the atoms on that DNA molecule. And so that's how they've mapped it. And because they have mapped it, they're able to specifically target one particular area in the gene, on the gene, where they can insert the DNA. So at least they're careful about doing that, and they know where they're doing it, and they're very, very precise about doing it. And I understand people being afraid of it and concerned about it. Yeah, it's something to be concerned about, I think. A lot of research has been done. In fact, there has been more research done on GMO plants than any other plant in history. And yet we still don't have all the answers. A lot of people, I think a lot of people think they've got the answers, and there are a lot of people in the world who have no worry whatsoever about coming in contact or eating a GMO plant or eating food processed from GMO plants. I think those are the people who are concerned about this are in the minority, actually. But for those of us who are in that minority, we need to be educated, and we don't need to let seed companies scare us into buying from them. No, think about what you are growing in your garden, and what chance do you have of actually producing a GMO plant or of buying a GMO seed. But let me read you something from this catalog. Let me back up 1 second. On the same page that I was going to read about GMO, it said a hybrid seed is created when the pollen from different plant varieties of the same species are crossed. This resulting cross produces the traits desired by the breeder. And this is how seedless watermelons are created. If you've ever wondered, how did you ever get a seedless watermelon? That's how. Because sort of like the mules, they don't reproduce very well. But that is within the same species. It's a different variety, two different varieties within the same species. And then when they're crossed, the resulting hybrid doesn't produce seeds very well. Okay, subsequent generations of seed, however, will not grow true to type when replanted. And that's what I just got through saying. Now, the same seed company, let me show you this what catalog this is. Have you ever heard of this catalog? This is So True Seed. It's way down there at the bottom. Let's get that. So True Seed. This company is located in Asheville, North Carolina, and it's been in business for 10 years. I didn't know it had been in business for 10 years. I first heard about it last year. But they're very, very environmentally conscious, and I like the idea of this company. But let me show you one thing that it has right here. It says, why So True Seed? And it goes on to the different reasons, and that's what I'm reading from right here. It says GMO free. They're saying that their seeds are GMO free, and that's great. Tell you what it says. So True Seed is committed to making seed and food free from genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, often referred to as genetically engineered. We the signatories on the Safe Seed Pledge, and that's below, it has what that is, put out by the Council for Responsible Genetics, and we do not knowingly produce, process, or sell GMO seed. Unfortunately, GMOs are now so widely grown that we cannot eradicate all risk of unintentional crosses. That risk, however small, exists for any grower whose neighbors use genetically engineered seed on cross-pollinating crops, despite best efforts at isolation. So, let's talk about that for a minute. First of all, So what are the genetic traits that are being produced in genetically modified organisms? There's actually 6. I think 6, maybe 4. 4. I was wrong. 4. The first one is insect resistance. So that means that's like corn and cotton. Corn is resistant to the corn earworm, and cotton is resistant to the bollworm. Virus resistant. So plants that are resistant to viruses, which is good in that it's not the virus. If they catch a virus, it's not going to kill them. Herbicide tolerant. We all know about herbicide tolerant. Herbicide tolerant are plants that are resistant to Roundup, and there are other couple of herbicides that have been developed too. And the last one is drought tolerance. Corn is the only GMO plant that I have read about that has the trait of drought tolerance introduced in it. So now let's talk about, so we know these are the traits that have been introduced, and not necessarily within just plants to plants. Well, some of them are, but other ones are not. For instance, 2 of them that I'm aware of, Roundup resistance is one, and the insect resistance is another. And both of those traits are introduced from bacteria. The insect resistance has been introduced from the bacterium called Bacillus thuringiensis, and that's called Bt. And the Roundup resistance was introduced from a bacteria called an agrobacterium. And that bacterium is actually used in genetic research. And I don't really understand how it could happen, but I have to study on that some more, but I haven't been able to find this out. But what happened was there was a plant that was producing glyphosate, which is Roundup. The chemical term for Roundup is glyphosate, and most of us know that. And in the runoff drains of this chemical plant, they found agrobacterium that had not been killed by the glyphosate. And so they looked at those bacteria more closely and discovered that they were able to pinpoint the gene that caused it to be resistant to Roundup, and then they transferred that gene into soybean. So that's where that started out. And I don't understand how bacterium would be susceptible to Roundup to begin with, because a plant has to be actively growing to be affected by Roundup. Roundup will only kill a plant that is actively growing. Roundup cannot be used as a what is it when you plant a seed? What is it called when you suppress it when a seed is planted and it's a chemical that keeps it from germinating? I've gone blank on that. I'll stick that in there. You know what I'm talking about, because there are chemicals that do that. They keep seeds from germinating. But that is not how Roundup works. For one thing, we know that Roundup is actually bound up in the soil, and that is a problem. But because it's bound up in the soil, it's not taken up by the plants. When the seeds are sown, very little, if any of it, is taken back up into the plants. And the way Roundup works is it keeps the plants from producing an enzyme that enables the plant to develop or to produce very important other enzymes and other chemicals, other proteins that are. So let me say this over again. The way Roundup works is it prevents the plant from producing chemicals that are necessary for the plant to grow and the plant to survive. So without those chemicals that the plant needs to produce, the plant dies, and that's how Roundup works. From what I've read, it occurs within the chloroplast of the plant. So that's what I don't understand about the agrobacterium. If it's not a plant, how does it work? I'll work on that, and I'll see if I can find out something. And if I can't, maybe you can find out too. Look it up and do some research for me, maybe. So here's what I've learned. There was an article that I just found today, because I started looking at, I wanted to know, I knew what plants were actually grown in the United States and that there are 8 plants actually actively grown in the U.S. But I didn't know which one was grown the most. And so I started looking today after I read this thing in this catalog. So what plants are actually grown in the United States and which ones are grown the most? Okay, the number 1 GMO plant that's grown in the United States is cotton. And cotton has an insect resistance and herbicide tolerance genes, one or the other or both in the cotton seeds. And 96% of all cotton, of all the acreage that is grown, is GMO. Very, very minimal chance if you are growing a cotton that is not GMO, that it's not going to be cross-pollinated with the GMO cotton. Unless, let's think about this. Cotton is insect pollinated. Cotton is not wind pollinated. So if the wind is blowing, you don't have to worry about having a field a mile away because the wind is not going to blow the cotton pollen from one field to another. Now we've all seen the charts that tell us how far apart do we have to isolate our different varieties to keep the genetics pure. And this is in almost any I won't say any catalog, but there are books written on it, and you can go online and you can look this up and you can find out. And it'll be a chart telling for people who are growing heirloom crops or open pollinated crops or a garden, how far apart do you have to plant 2 different varieties of tomatoes for them not to cross-pollinate? How far apart do you have to grow 2 different varieties of lettuce for them not to cross-pollinate? Okay, maybe that's a bad example. But what I mean to say is we have these charts that tell us how far apart you have to grow your plants to minimize the risk of cross-pollination by wind or by insects. The plants that are insect pollinated can be closer together because insects can be blocked by a field or a whole field of another crop or a barrier of some kind. Maybe you grow corn in the middle of your garden and you grow one thing on one side of the corn and something else on the other side of the corn, and that reduces the chance that the same species but different varieties of plants on the 2 different sides of the garden are going to be cross-pollinated by the insects. So let's think about that. You want to isolate your plants. You know that a farmer down the road is growing a GMO crop, and you don't want your crop to be cross-pollinated with his crop. How far apart, how far do you have to be living away from that farmer to keep your crop from being cross-pollinated? Okay, so let's think about that. Keep thinking about that while I'm talking about these other things. The next plant, the next most populous, say, plant, sugar beets are the second most often grown plant. 95% of the sugar beets grown in this country are GMO. Now, is that a problem? Sugar beets are wind pollinated. So that could be a problem because chard and beets, regular beets, and I'm thinking lamb's quarters? I'm not sure about that. But I know chard and beets, regular beet roots, are also in the same species as sugar beets. But what did the scientists do? Scientists thought about that. And what they did is, did you know that beets are biennial? That means if you harvest your crop of beet roots and the beets don't ever live to produce to the second year, then there's going to be no chance whatsoever of the pollen being spread or being transferred from one field to the other field. The only place that could be a problem is in Oregon. And Oregon is the only state in the country that produces beet seed. So there could be a problem for farmers who are growing beets and chard in Oregon. They're going to have to be very, very careful if they how far apart they are with the beet producers. Okay, sugar beet producers. The next plant is soybeans. Oh, I wanted to say back to beets. Herbicide tolerance is the only trait. Roundup resistance is in beets. Soybean, the same thing. Roundup resistance. Okay, soybean is third on the list. 94% of the soybean grown in this country is herbicide tolerant. GMO. That's a lot of soybeans. Soybean is insect pollinated. It's a legume. So, we don't worry about wind pollination with soybeans. The fourth most plant, number 4 on my list, is corn. And you would think corn was number 1 as much corn as we have. 93% of corn is GMO. GMO traits in corn include insect resistance, herbicide resistance, and also drought resistance. And again, not all of the corn has all 3 traits. There may be one variety that is only insect resistance, another variety that only has herbicide resistance, another variety, you know what I mean. So a few of them, I'm sure, probably have all 3 traits, but the ones that are drought resistant are going to be the ones that are grown more out west, where the corn would have a chance of having to tolerate a drought. The 5th most populous, I keep saying most populous, most common plant is canola. You know, canola oil. Well, canola also produces flowers and is insect pollinated. It's pollinated by bees again. That's Roundup tolerant herbicide. 90% of canola in the United States is herbicide tolerant, is GMO. Now we get to papaya. Papaya is only grown in the warmest regions of this country. It's mostly grown farther south than, I would say, the Caribbean and maybe Central America and other places. Florida and maybe Texas. I don't know where else papaya would be grown. Maybe California. I don't know. Those of you who grow papaya can let me know on that. Papaya has a virus-resistant trait engineered into it. 50% of the papaya grown in the country are virus-resistant. 7th on the list is alfalfa. Yeah, these alfalfa sprouts that we buy and that we eat could very well be GMO. That could be a problem. Most of the alfalfa, though, is used for animal feed. Alfalfa, only 30% of the alfalfa grown is herbicide resistance. Has herbicide resistance, is Roundup tolerant. So 70% of the alfalfa is not. So that's a good way to think about it. And if you're a farmer, then there's probably going to be a lot better chance that your animal feed is not going to be crossed with the herbicide tolerant alfalfa. And the last, number 8 on the list, is summer squash. Now summer squash is new in the game, and the summer squash is herbicide tolerant. And the summer squash is produced by Monsanto, as you would suspect, but not all of the plants, not all of the seed, the herbicide resistance in the GMO plants are produced by Monsanto. A lot of it is, but some of it is not. But I looked this up. That concerned me. You very well might be growing summer squash in your garden. You might be growing yellow squash, crookneck squash, straight neck squash, zucchini. These are summer squash. So I was concerned about this, and I looked this up. And I discovered that the only place you can actually buy GMO seed is from a seed company that sells to farmers who are growing acres and acres of crops. Large fields of crops. And they have to go to a specialty store to buy it. You can't just go to your mom and pop store down the road. You can't go online and buy this. You have to sign a contract with the company before you even purchase the seed. And I believe it's actually, if the GMO trait is produced by Monsanto or whatever company that was produced that GMO trait, they patented that trait. So there is a patent on each of these traits, and the company that patented that trait, then you have to sign a contract with that company not to save that seed from it. We know what happens when somebody does that. So, if you have not signed a contract for your seed, then the chances are you're not buying GMO seed. And you don't have to worry about buying GMO seed from just about any seed company. You're only going to buy it in person, probably from a co-op or a farmer's co-op, something like that, a place that's selling seed to commercial farmers. Otherwise, the chances are you're not going to be buying it, and don't worry about it. You don't have to worry about squash seed that's GMO. You don't have to worry about corn seed that's GMO. If you don't want to grow it, you're not going to sign the contract. So we don't need to worry about that. Okay? That kind of put my mind at ease. I didn't realize that. But there is a problem, though, of a home grower. Someone who is growing corn in their garden, and there's a neighbor down the road who is growing a GMO corn, and there's a good chance if the corn is being grown down the road with, what did I say, 93% of the corn in the country grown being GMO, then there is a really good chance that the corn down the road is going to be GMO. So you need to be very, very careful where you plant your corn. And if it turns out that your neighbor has GMO corn, you need to check and see how far apart his field is from where your garden is. And if that's within the non-safe distance, you may want to reconsider growing corn. And that's sad. I hate to think about that. But that's the bad news. But the good news is that there are only eight plants, 8 species of crops grown in the United States that are GMO. And of those, only 2 of those would really stand a chance of being pollinated in our garden by a GMO plant in somebody else's garden. And those would be corn, which is wind pollinated, and the squash, which is insect pollinated. So the squash, you need to look at the isolation distances to keep your heirloom crops pure. And that's how far apart you need to plant those crops from your neighbor who is growing GMO plants. And that's all I can tell you about that. But I hope I'm able to get you to think about this a little bit, and the scare tactics that some of these companies are going through. Like this company, I wouldn't call it a scare tactic. Not a scare tactic. But they're taking advantage of everybody being so afraid of GMOs, and they want everybody to buy their seed by letting us know that they have signed this pledge. And they're saying that GMOs are so widely grown that they can't eradicate all risk of unintentional crosses. That's true of corn, and that's true of squash. But you don't have to worry about anything else, because you're probably not going to be growing it in your garden. So, bye, y'all.